Good afternoon and welcome, bienvenue, to Exploring the Politics of Religious and Independent Schools in Canada. My name is Joanna DeJong and I'm the Program Director for Education here at Cardus. We're so glad you could join us for this final webinar in a series of webinars in celebration of Cardus's 25th anniversary. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with Cardus Education, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction to who we are. Cardus is a public policy think tank rooted in the Christian social thought tradition. And what this means for Cardus Education is two things. First, we believe in the fundamental God-given dignity of all human beings, including children, and that the purpose of an education is formation that honors this dignity, to deeply invest in a student's vocational, cultural, and spiritual formation through learning opportunities that align with their unique gifts and abilities, and within communities that honor their cultural and religious values. Because of this, we engage in research and policy that allows schools of all kinds to flourish. Second, we believe that humans were made for community, and that education is not purely an individual undertaking. Even when we're talking about the primary unit of the family or education in the home, homeschooling, education always has a public or a social impact. Education is not just about meeting the needs of each individual, it's also about the reality of living in community, in society, and of building a common life together. Today, we're exploring a topic that exists at the nexus of these two beliefs. Religious and independent schools have always been a part of the Canadian education story. Despite very different legal and political histories, they remain a fairly strong voice within almost every province, and interest in them is growing. In Ontario, in just the last 3 years, we've recorded strong growth in new independent schools. Alongside a wide variety of non-religious independent schools, we also see new independent Catholic, Jewish, and Islamic schools. What do these schools have to offer? What role have they played in our past? And what role do or should they continue to play in our future? I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Jim Farney as our featured guest this afternoon to join me in the first part of this conversation. Dr. Farney is a professor and director of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, where he has also served until his appointment as the head of the Department of Politics and International Studies. He has written extensively on Canadian politics, political parties, education policy, and institutional change. And he is co-author with Dr. Clark Banack of the recent book, which I highly recommend and have here with me, Faith, Rights, and Choice, The Politics of Religious Schools in Canada. I found this to be extremely valuable in understanding the history and the politics of independent education. Jim is also a longtime friend of Cardus, and we're thrilled to have him here for this conversation. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Joanna. It's lovely.
Jim, I wanted to start with sort of an initial question about the framing of this book. You organized the history of religious and independent education into three sort of broad regimes, or maybe they could sort of also be considered eras, which are characterized by a particular orientation toward public discourse. So those three are faith, sort of the early history of Canadian history and shared history and the way that independent schools position themselves, and then rights discourse took over sort of post-World War II. And then following that, there was sort of a move towards adopting choice discourse in maybe around 1970s and onward. Could you say a little bit more about each regime and what characterizes the arguments for independent education in each?
Yeah, so it's, and some folks on the call may have seen a version of this, like I'm afraid to say almost a decade ago, in 2016, 2017, Beth Green and Dee Van Pelt had me along for a series of Cardus education talks, and I was kind of sketching out an early version of what became this book's argument. And what Clark and I were trying to do in it is because education's a provincial jurisdiction in Canada, we get quite distinct provincial kind of trajectories and especially politics around it. And so while the provinces in some ways some of them end up in clusters, the paths of how they get there, and so the place of faith-based arguments in education politics we thought were quite distinctive. And what we tried to build out was a bit of an incomplete layer cake. So all the provinces go through a period where there's kind of a faith-focused discussion around state-supported education, and then by extension, independent schools. Most of them have some form of a rights-based period, which was we had trouble defining it. It's like you say, post-war to sometime in the 80s. Sometimes the focus is minority language, sometimes it's faith. And then with roots that go back a little bit earlier, some of them, Quebec and the four Western ones, clearly have a stage that we call choice, where there's policy regimes built where there's some state support provided to independent schools broadly. Most of them, not all, but most are faith-based or have roots with some differences. So province by province, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia do in the right around the Confederation period have a really significant contention around the Protestant Catholic split. By the 1960s, though, that's slowly disappearing, and it was actually hard reaching out to experts in those provinces to find anybody to talk to about are there religious differences. So the way that they work is they do have fully private schools, but anything getting government money is a secular public school. The carve out until the 1960s was that schools in predominantly Catholic neighborhoods might well hire nuns to be teachers. And if nuns brought crucifixes and used Catholic versions of the Bible, well, that was simply the teaching staff around. And like I say, by about 1960, that really phased out. Newfoundland is fascinating and different, as I think many folks on the call will know. When the province joined Confederation in 1949, there was a constitutional entrenchment of the existing religious school systems. There was no single public system. There were 6 or 7, depending on how you counted it, Christian denominational systems that got public money. That lasted until the 1990s, when after 2 referendums and 2 attempts at amending the Constitution, they moved to a single public system. And the discussion there was still very much faith and focused on faith. There are a handful of private schools in the island. To the best of my knowledge, they're all varieties of Christian. Quebec, at the end, will talk to more than I will, but it too was very much formed by faith through to the 1960s, when you start to get more contention around minority language rights. And the story of independent school sector in Quebec, which is the largest independent school sector by enrollment in the country, is very much based on how do we accommodate both the Jewish minority in Montreal and Anglophones in the kind of post-Bill 101 1980s. So it's quite distinctive, but they did land on a place where parental choice was built into the independent school system and state subsidies provided to those. Ontario has been stuck on faith forever. And it was interesting doing interviews with people. The last big evolution of that system was the extension of full funding to Catholic separate high schools in the 1980s. Asterisks debate about whether those separate Catholic schools should be classed as religious or public. Anybody working in that system insists that they're public that I've ever spoken with. But there was a very clear distinction, despite a Royal Commission saying we should look at choice, we should extend the choice system that by that point was talked about across the country, that would be a step too far for social cohesion. And so they stopped with funding for Catholic entrenched schools. And then in the West, what you have is BC and Manitoba in, again, very different constitutional backgrounds, but have a state-supported independent school sector, no protections for no no constitutional protections for Catholic separate schools, and Alberta and Saskatchewan have all of the above. So we have constitutionally protected 93 separate systems. We have multiple categories of independent schools. We have essentially charter schools under public boards. So I count, and again, you could debate. I think Alberta has 7 separate ways for schools to get public money, plus the homeschooling system. Saskatchewan's got 6. But the gist is that there is a mechanism both for different categories of faith-based schools to get government support.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Is there anything in writing this book that in any province or jurisdiction that really kind of surprised you or that stood out to you when you think about the landscape of different arrangements for funding or for the ways that independent schools have made these arguments?
I'd say there were the debates crossed partisan lines in ways I didn't expect. So that was there. I think the 2 stories I found very interesting was the story in BC and the story in Manitoba. So in both cases, what you had in the 1970s, 1980s was a coming together of different faith communities, initially all various forms of Christianity, into a single federation. So the Federation of Independent Schools of BC and the Federation of Independent Schools in Manitoba. In Manitoba, the Catholic part, which to this day maintains parochial schools, made the explicit decision to not pursue a constitutional challenge. So they felt that they might have a Section 93 challenge to a separate, fully funded separate school system on the basis that there were existing Catholic schools and Manitoba became a province. They made a decision to work, especially with Mennonite and evangelical Christian schools, to have a single framework that would include all of them. I thought BC, that there was no constitutional claim because there were no separate schools when BC entered Confederation. But there was a similar alliance built. The Dutch Reform community in Abbotsford played a particularly important role. And over time, those political networks have expanded to include what I would call secular prep schools, newer religions to Canada like Islam. And I think those federations do a really good job of integrating kind of different types of schools and diverse populations together in a way that the category independent school is not always given credit for.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I think that leads actually kind of directly into my next question, which is that what I frequently encounter when I'm talking about educational pluralism or religious schools in public, I encounter the objection that religious schooling or just independent schooling writ large really is counterproductive to social cohesion, that it means students exist in silos and that it is not really something that's oriented towards building a common story or common good. But I would say that counter is sort of countered with my admittedly anecdotal, but experiences within independent education communities. So for example, recently I was in a meeting in which Jewish and Muslim school leaders were at the same table, acknowledging both the deep divide that currently exists within that community, but also expressing appreciation for a common goal of recognition for independent schools. And I'm not sure you find that type of collaboration or conversation in many other spaces. And so when you write about how these regimes, certain provinces, the discourse moved away from primarily a faith-based framework towards rights or towards choice, as you say, it often involved very diverse communities coming together, aligning their interests together, working together towards a common goal. Would you say that your work confirms my experiences? Is there something there that could be kind of expanded on?
Yeah, so I think if you think of social cohesion as cultural, I've there's an old typology in political science about the difference between bridging and bonding social capital. Goes back to Putnam's work, and the notion that healthy societies have both. And to me, there's been Cardus had done a little bit of work with polling on this about 10 years ago and found going to an independent school didn't make any difference to your kind of citizenship orientations. That makes sense to me because you'd expect kind of stronger bonding social capital from people going to an independent school, and in many of them, a pretty strong citizenship orientation and a practice of citizenship that's helpful more broadly. Where I think the question gets more complex and where my team is kind of doing a variety of different looks today is I think there is a discussion that needs to be looked at empirically around economic stratification in education. Obviously, independent schools charge tuition. And so whether they're religious or not, there's a class factor there. My hunch is, though, that it's not the most important class factor if you look at the educational landscape as a whole. Parents make all sorts of time investments and money investments, from psychological exams to after-school sports to music lessons, where there is a difference in the opportunities you can give your kids. And independent schools might be the easiest thing to look at, but I suspect if we were to add it up in aggregate, we'd find a much more complex story in Canada than we're willing to admit. We have a much less hierarchical education system than the States does, but I think we are seeing growing evidence of equality of opportunity problem right across the system.
Yeah, that comports with what we'd call sort of the rise in auxiliary education, platforms, things like tutoring, options, those kinds of things, I think are certainly growing. And it would be interesting to see that sort of aggregate work done, as you mentioned. Switching gears a little bit, I guess going back to the historical scope of your work. To what extent would you say that an accommodation of educational pluralism, insofar as room has been made for alternative educational options, is an integral part of Canadian history and who we are as Canadians? I think that frequently as Canadians, we sort of have this adage that what does it mean to be Canadian? Well, it means that we're not necessarily American. And I think the school choice conversation is often viewed through an American lens. I'm curious to what extent you feel that your book and your work actually roots the accommodation of independent schooling within a larger Canadian story.
It's the case we try to, what we say in the book is we see it as Canada's first policy-oriented way to accommodate diversity, right? And going right back to 1763 and the Quebec Act, it's how do we deal with a Protestant and a Catholic culture, right? So I think there is a case to be made that it's really deeply rooted for us. We'd done a paper after the book came out where we took subnational jurisdictions in Australia, Canada, the UK, and Germany on independent school policy and did a cluster analysis. We wanted to see, did the countries cluster together when we broke up lander and provinces and stuff? And what was interesting was you didn't get a Canada cluster. The UK is its own story, but you didn't get like an Australia, a Canada, a Germany cluster. You got a lot of overlap. And so what I think even more than a Canada story is there's a Quebec story, there is an Ontario story, and then there's a Western and an Atlantic story. So even within Canada, these are really provincial stories. And if I can be a slightly grumpy Westerner, I get upset about how the Ontario landscape frames most of the conversation in the country.
Yeah, I think the slight grumpiness is is allowed in this case. All right, I'd love to welcome Etienne Alexandre to the conversation. And so before we keep going, let me briefly introduce Etienne to our audience. Etienne Alexandre Beauregard joined Cardus recently as a researcher, and he was raised in Quebec City, holds a BA in political philosophy, and is currently working on an MA in public policy. Prior to joining Cardus, he worked as a speechwriter and strategic planning advisor in the office of Premier Legault in Quebec. And he has also authored 3 books on political thought. The most recent book being Anti-civilisation, Pourquoi nos sociétés s'effondrent de l'intérieur, or in English, Anti-civilization, Why Our Societies Are Collapsing from Within. Etienne, thanks for joining us to bring us a little bit of the Quebec perspective.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Joanna.
It's great. Yeah, as you know, when I was planning this conversation, I thought it would be really interesting to have you join us to provide a bit of the Quebec lens because it's such a unique one to the rest of Canada. Quebec understands the relationship between religious expression and the state differently, I think, than the rest of Canada does. And that has impacted how education is understood in the province. I know you've authored a paper that will be released later on this fall on educational pluralism in Quebec. And I'm wondering if you can just begin, though, by explaining for any of our listeners who may be less familiar with Quebec, a brief historical background on education in that province. How did the Quiet Revolution radically alter the landscape in Quebec's education system? And what has Quebec's approach to minority education been?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing we need to understand in Quebec's history of relationship with independent education is that there was indeed a big shift around the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, because originally the colony, the New France, was built by Christian congregations. And so the first schools to emerge in Quebec are naturally independent and Christian schools, because that was before you would have public schooling. And so, for example, the Jesuit College in Quebec City, which I had the pleasure to attend in high school, was founded in 1635. So that's 1 year before Harvard College, which makes it the oldest college in North America. So there is indeed an old tradition of independent schooling and Christian independent schooling in Quebec. And so I think the lens through which independent schooling was approached for a long part of our history was certainly shaped by the fact that the common school movement was perceived as an assimilation movement from the Anglo-Protestant group. And this was also true in the United States, for example, and Jim's book shows it quite well, that it was directed against Catholics as a way to assimilate them into eventually becoming Protestants. So certainly it was a like minority language proposition to have more independent schools. And so they were seen in Quebec as like the bastion for French education. And this is not only true in Quebec, within Canada, because when you look at, for example, the Manitoba school crisis or Ruling 17 in Ontario, where essentially French was restricted or forbidden from the public school system, then naturally independent schooling became the place to go if you wanted your children to grow up and be educated in French. So certainly for the first part of our country's history, this lens was the one through which Francophones would approach independent schooling as a way to defend their language. So it's more like the right lens that Jim describes. And however, when you get to the middle of the 20th century, there is what we now call the Quiet Revolution, or as one could resume it, like the embracing of the state by Quebecers as the primary instrument of their flourishing. And so in the 60s, there was indeed the development of a much bigger public French school system. And so this kind of changed the relationship that we would have to independent schooling. And we have to mention, though, that when this new public system was established, there was this commission called the Parent Commission, which essentially set the public school system to be. And there was some kind of a truce or an equilibrium that was found at this time, which is now the bedrock of what we could call the Quebec model of educational pluralism. And so the commission recognized and stated that independent schools play a role for the common good. and that they must be supported in this name because they saw that there were indeed many ways to reach the common good that is education. And certainly the long history of independent schooling in Quebec did advocate for at least maintaining these schools and recognizing their historic contribution. And so many of these schools are today what we would call state-funded independent schools, where they have about 60% of student tuition that is funded, albeit it comes with the most stringent curriculum rules in Canada for what schools must teach in order to get funding. It was the compromise that was found at this time that there was like this common curriculum in exchange for state funding. And so Quebec today is the second province with the most students in independent schools, about 10%. I think first one is British Columbia with about 13%. So we're certainly ahead of the pack. And so I think that there is a peculiar arrangement today that we could indeed call a Quebec model of educational pluralism. It is, I think, a good equilibrium that can certainly be fine-tuned, for example, by allowing new schools to get funding or to give the funding bonus that public schools get when they take in special needs students. But certainly there is an example simply by facts and by what has happened in the last decades that shows that independent schooling can indeed be a way to reach the common good that is education through different manners and different initiatives.
Yeah, thanks, Etienne. I think to sort of move from that historical context into the current present day where Quebec is really answering the question of national identity differently than the rest of Canada with secularism laws. And that there is I think a stronger, you would probably argue this too, a stronger sense or concept of national identity or political community to be formed into. In contemporary Quebec, I think you have also mentioned to me before, there's this intermingling of the common school movement with that secularism or the ideals of laicite. What sort of was the shift that brought this about after, if we had this compromise after the parent commission, and things sort of seemed to be settled or in a fairly good arrangement? What has brought about this sort of intermingling of the common school movement and secularism ideals?
Yeah, I think to fully grasp this, you have to realize just the central place that nationalism and the nationalist movement takes in Quebec politics, because obviously being a minority nation in North America certainly makes Quebecers more aware of their cultural reality and more attentive to this factor than English Canadians probably can be, being the majority language on the continent. And so if we go back to this shift that happened in the Quiet Revolution, it was really this embrace of the state as a way to realize the Quebec nation's flourishing. And I think Bill 101 was obviously like the first instrumentalization of that, or like the first way it was to be realized more concretely. And so this idea that the public system would, except for the historic Anglophone minority, be used to integrate immigrants into the French nation by having to mandatorily attend French schools was certainly a demonstration of this. This idea that it could indeed be a way for the French majority to grow up with the children of immigrants and come to share a common culture. And so this came about through some political crisis that they called the Saint-Léonard crisis, because it was essentially with the Italian immigrants back there, question being, should they attend English schools or French schools? And so the movement that formed at this moment was called the Movement for School Integration, Mouvement pour l'intégration scolaire. And their main argument was that in order to essentially maintain French as the majority language in Quebec, newcomers who are not historic Anglos would have to attend French schools, because otherwise the linguistic and cultural dynamics of North America would make it so that French would face an irredeemable decline in Quebec. I think mostly they were right. However, around the 21st century, the question of secularism comes about too. And this time mostly with what they called the crisis of religious accommodations, being with newer religions in Canada, such as Islam. And so the question being, like, how do we integrate, how do we build bridges between communities? And so the response that was found at that time was to say that public schools, not private or independent ones, should also embrace a form of secularism as a way um, to have a full neutrality that would not cause any children to be imposed beliefs upon. And so this materialized through what we call Bill 21. And so it made it so essentially teachers in public schools cannot wear religious symbols. And what's maybe interesting is to see that this secularization in the facts is not really new, in the sense that after the 60s and the 70s, Quebec society secularized extremely fast. If you just look at the rates of attendance to mass, it dropped extremely quickly within 10 years. And so there was within the public school system a de facto secularism, in the sense that it was not religious teachings that were done in public schools. So this new debate was really about the appearance of neutrality for teachers. And so that's really what it focused on, saying if you are a representative of state authority in being a public school teacher, do you have to show that you are neutral by not wearing religious symbols? So certainly most Quebec nationalists would tell you that there is indeed a continuity between these two movements, being Bill 101 and Bill 21. They're often mentioned in the same breath, and the same idea of this public school system as a way to integrate diversity into a common mold that is Quebec nation. And so I think this tells you a bit, because it kind of shows how like this intermingling of nationalism with the state as an instrument kind of gave us these two bills that certainly shaped the vision of what schooling should be in Quebec, and as a way to integrate that maybe we don't find in the rest of Canada.
Yeah, that's helpful. And building on that, then, in this new sort of context that independent and religious schools find themselves operating within, in your view, how is it possible for religious and independent schools to fit into that project of secularism, or how should they function within the norms of a secular state in a way that continues also to build those bridges?
Yeah, I think it's a debate that we're having more and more with the new secularism report that dropped in the last few months in Quebec. And to me, I think there is an argument for saying that public schools should indeed be neutral, because being like literally operated by the state, they do receive children from all confessions, and there is certainly no way that they could like strongly take position in favor of one or another, because children are, like, I don't want to say compelled, but certainly they have to go there if they don't go to another institution by exercising their right to choice. So there are maybe there is a higher standard of neutrality that can be asked within state institutions. But I think that it would be a fundamental misconception to believe that because independent schools get some state funding, or simply by the fact of being schools, that the same bar can be applied to them. Because I think that we have a model that works quite well, that was established in the 60s, saying that independent schools can indeed be a way to reach the common good that is education. And it's not a license, it's not a free ticket to state funding. When you do get funding, it's because you abide by a common curriculum that is extremely strict. It's the strictest one that you can find in Canada. So certainly if there is abuse, and even if these independent schools are not religious, there can be abuse. And so certainly the state has a duty to enforce and make sure that what it does ask in return for funding is applied. But this is not a religious issue, in my opinion. And so I think that, yes, if independent schools are private institutions to some extent, they're not state operated, then they should be allowed to have their own vision of education, as long as they do abide by the curriculum. And this is just like another concrete manifestation of this kind of diverse pathways towards the common good. And I think indeed there would be a danger if the state or some activists thought that independent institutions, and it's not only schools, it's really any institution that is not run by the state, but that gets often some state funds, which is especially often the case in Quebec, that they do have to abide by some standards that are those of public institutions. So if there was like this kind of state creep into civil society, I think it would be indeed a worrying development.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe this question I'll ask to both of you to kind of broaden the conversation a little bit. I find frequently that across the country, when we have conversations around independent schooling, it's often viewed as a zero-sum kind of culture war game, that there's independent schools are sort of on one side, public or district schools on the other side. And we have this in terms of recent calls to defund independent schools in Quebec. We now have it in Alberta with this citizens initiative petition that is also calling for defunding independent schools. Is it possible, do you think, to move beyond this when it comes to this conversation? Is it possible to think differently about education? And is there something that advocates of both systems can learn from one another? Maybe Jim, I'll put it to you first, and then Etienne.
Really, it's a really hard question. The politics of changing the framing, in the book, we look at a lot of cases where there's a transition from, say, faith rights, right? And they are often incredibly idiosyncratic. Like so I don't see a common strategy to do it. I think there are opportunities that emerge to have public conversations, and I think an alertness to when is the time right to have a conversation. I also think in some ways the biggest obstacle is misunderstanding what modern public systems look like. The notion that they are all built around the neighborhood school where everyone is in the same classroom with a locally elected and powerful school district or school board of local trustees is a very outdated image. In big urban settings, you see lots of differentiation inside the public system. Some of it breaks out by aptitude, some by area of study, some by culture. We see the French immersion as almost like a kind of private-ish school in terms of the demographics across the country. And I think that misunderstanding covers over, like, many of the dynamics that public school advocates worry about are actually baked into their own system. The story that I think many people don't hear often enough is the type of experimentation and innovation in pedagogy, in public service, in training for the public good that you can see in independent schools. They are typecast as simply religious institutions or simply prep schools in a way that I don't think mirrors their reality very well either. And so up until we have one of those moments of changes, moments of a kind of stronger public discourse, I think there is just a kind of baseline truth test of how we understand the two sides. It's a really important place to start.
Yeah, that's helpful. Etienne, did you have anything?
Well, certainly there is truth to what you said about this, like, culture war zero-sum game for some that pit public schooling and independent schooling. And though I have to say I've read a lot of these writings when I'm preparing this upcoming paper that you discussed, and there is certainly for some this. I want to call it an ideological drive for uniformity, because sometimes it's not really based on children's needs. And to me, that's where it gets dangerous, because if the simple fact that different children attend different programs or different services that are more attuned to their needs or future aspirations causes a problem in itself, I'm not sure that there is indeed like fact-based argument to say that this is wrong. Certainly, some have a problem with it, but then they would have to explain it with data and saying why this is wrong. And especially when you look at just the pure market dynamics of it, this is what families want, and this is what get students into these programs. So they're not coerced or anything. So certainly it would be hard to really walk back on this because certainly there is an appetite for this. And so, although we can say that financial barriers, when it's purely a financial barriers, it's kind of harder to defend. And this, there would be room for improvement. I think most people would agree. But on the pure diversity aspect, I think the Quebec example is very interesting because there is already some kind of dialogue between the two models. You just look at recent evolutions in public schooling in Quebec, the emergence of what they call special programs like sports study or art study, when some periods over the school week will be reserved for some activities that some children like. It is an example of pluralism within the public sector, which was entirely brought about by the fact that these kind of programs were emerging in the independent schooling network and that families were gravitating towards them because it was good for motivation. It was very good for children who really liked them and it gave them the will to go to school. So certainly there was here an innovation that was born in the independent sector and then that came into the public sector that made it available to most children. Actually, to this day, if I look at the Ministry of Education stats, it says that 50.9% of students in the public network are enrolled in a special program. So certainly it is a successful innovation that came from the independent network, and now that seems to be quite generalized in the public network. And if you look on the other side, oftentimes a reproach that you will hear against the independent sector in Quebec is that of elitism or cream skimming and the fact that they would not take enough special needs students. Now, there could be some basis to that because I've explained before that they do not get the financial bonus that public schools get to give these children the services they need. But when you look at the larger dynamic here, a number that is very little known in the public discourse is that in the last 10 years, the number of special needs students as defined by the Ministry of Education who are in independent institutions in Quebec has grown by 200%, more than 200%, while in the public network, it is only has only grown by 30%. So you see that clearly there is one network that has made some effort to integrate more of these children, and there are some very inspiring examples. You just look at Le Collège Champigny in Quebec City, where I'm from. They have this program they call Two-Thirds, which essentially allows students to do their high school in 6 years rather than 5, with more adapted schedule, with more physical education. And it is directly targeted towards children who are not top of their class, but who have this will to succeed, and really with a targeted teaching for this sensibility. So I think it's extremely interesting, and it kind of debunks this myth that independent education is only an elitist thing for the so-called cream of the crop, because there you see an institution that makes this outreach to special needs students in order to get them to succeed. And funny thing is, the same institution also proposes to finish high school in 4 years rather than 5. So clearly they have this very adapted offer for every kind of profile, and we would never see this, at least first in the public network. So maybe this is a kind of innovation that you would also like to see emerge in the public network. And so I think there is a very interesting to say about this dialogue that's going on, which kind of disproves this idea of a zero-sum culture wars, because in the fact, and there are some preoccupations and some innovations that do travel from one network to another.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks. We have some time for some audience questions now, and I have a number here that I'll pose. I think the first one is really just a clarification question, which probably we should respond to. Etienne, it says here, it sounds like secularism and neutrality are being seen as the same thing. And is that the sort of the Cardus stance? So I think that there's a particular Quebec dynamic here that maybe you want to speak to.
Yeah, well, I'm
Yeah,
explaining the discourse that is prevalent in Quebec. There is certainly an argument to be made that oftentimes secularism can become anti-religious and then stops being neutral. But in seeing how it is seen in the mainstream discourse in Quebec, certainly it is seen as though neutrality and secularism are alike. Maybe there is some work to be done in order to really explain the difference between the two concepts. But I'm sure the audience here knows it very well. But certainly, when you look at the political discourse that has gone on in the debate around Bill 21, but also broader debate around secularism in the public network, certainly there is this conception that is going on. Yes.
yeah, I think that's helpful. And um, like you make the comment that secularism as well can be sort of captured by ideology, and I think that's probably where what the question is
Yeah.
referring
Just
to. Yeah. Okay, so there is a question here from someone in BC. When we talk about standards in education, we assume a neutral worldview or paradigm. What do you think educators in independent schools overlook in terms of faith communities and deficiencies in the standards for faith communities to flourish? I'm not sure quite what the last part of that question is getting to. But basically, is there anything that educators in independent schools might overlook in terms of the standards for faith communities to flourish? Maybe to rephrase it, how should religious schools think about themselves, and in particular think about standards in education in relation to the states or into the assumption of a neutral worldview or paradigm?
That's a hard one, I think. And kind of by definition, there is no singular answer across the sector, right? I mean, obviously, there's a big range. I think what I would see as kind of a baseline difference is the treatment of faith in almost every. I can't say I visited a representative sample of independent schools in the book, but like that faith was part of the curriculum as more than just what I'd call a religious studies point of view, right? Like it's not there as a thing to be studied, but it is there as a thing to be lived as the starting point. Often it's combined in lots of different ways. So I don't think the faith part of the curriculum can be neutral if it's a school that defines itself in those terms. Many independent schools don't, but for the ones who do, like it's clearly a worldview students are part of. I think where the state would have a baseline interest is saying that has to be combined with a recognition of the diversity of the country. And I think this is where some of the differences between French and English Canada become really important, like the kind of intercultural language of the Bouchard-Taylor report 20 years ago would be very easy to combine with that. I think it is much harder for Quebec's contemporary discourse to work. I think there are some culture war issues at play in English Canada that make that type of easy accommodation increasingly difficult in a lot of provinces. But to me, that would be the baseline starting point. And I think there is a very practical question of whether the path to teacher accreditation allows for the types of training and education that allow people to do that in a kind of professional and sophisticated way.
Yeah, that's great. I think what we're coming up against in this question is the limits of pluralism. And I like what you've said there, that there should be a recognition of the diversity that does exist in the rest of the country, sort of at minimum. And perhaps that's where we could say that there maybe needs to be some consideration by in particular religious communities, but all independent school communities towards understanding that, or towards ensuring that that's incorporated into curriculum.
I mean, another way, maybe a simpler way to put it is I think independent schools that are a choice for something, religious communities that are choosing for something in their schooling choices are on very solid ground. I worry sometimes about friends, because this work has always got personal backstories, friends who are choosing religious schooling to run away from something, right? And of course, parents want to protect their kids from things they see as harmful, but there are dynamics in those two things that I think are quite different.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Absolutely. I have another question here from someone, also just probably a clarification question, Etienne, about Bill 21. Can hijabs be worn in schools? What about turbans? What religious symbols does this apply to?
Yeah, so if you compare it with French secularism, for example, it's really quite minimal. Like the only professions that are affected by Bill 21 is if you are a policeman, a judge, a prison guard, or a public school teacher. That's not a lot of people, but it applies to every religious symbol as long as it is visible. So there is no none are targeted while others are not targeted. It's really anything that is a religious symbol. Although some could say that there are indeed some liminal cases where is it religious or not? Like some called like this the wedding ring, is it a religious symbol? Like there are all these questions that come up on the margins, but I think broadly people know what is targeted. And also it is a small number of professions, so it does not apply to students and does not apply to independent schools, even if they get funding. Does not apply to daycares, although the government has announced that they might have this intention. But as of now, it's really quite minimalistic. It's maybe 4 or 5 professions that are indeed targeted by the bill.
Great. Switching gears again, I think this is kind of going back a little bit to the question that we answered previously, but it takes a slightly different tone. If curriculum violates deeply held religious convictions, should independent schools that don't receive funding be forced into compliance? So again, kind of butting up against the sort of limits of pluralism conversation, but also are there certain things that are non-negotiables? And or is it the case, because the question does specify independent schools that don't receive funding. I think the way that I would view that is typically throughout provincial arrangements and different provincial arrangements, independent schools that have not wanted to comply with particular curricular requirements or particular also then opt out or do not receive the funding that exists. But it's not that they are not allowed to operate at all. So that freedom has always existed within Canada. I think it would be quite a significant step to remove that altogether.
Yeah, and I would argue also that this whole question is really about finding an equilibrium between what is common and where there is a room for pluralism. So certainly as independent institutions have to comply with a form of education in order to get broadly a common citizenship and common knowledge, and this is not only apply in humanities, it's also about math or science or whatever. So like I think most people would understand like this need for a common basis, but also I think on the part of the state, it does have a responsibility to recognize the diversity of beliefs and not to put in this curriculum values or things that are too loaded and that are not like particularly skill focused and that really cause some clashes of conscience for some. So certainly I think responsibilities are on both sides, and if we are to find an equilibrium between what is common and between diversity, then both sides, being the independent institutions and the state, have to work towards this manageable compromise.
Yeah, these are always really hard cases, and I think the clear cases where there's a need for state intervention, be things like child abuse, which can happen in public schools as well, or both Saskatoon in a private independent school and Montreal in public schools have had recent cases of excessive corporal punishment for kids. So I think there's a clear state obligation in that type of thing. There's an old test in the literature on multiculturalism that I suspect the literature is probably moved on from, but one of the tests is the education sufficient to ensure right of exit? Like, we are fundamentally a liberal country, and so you are free to do a lot of things in a non-funded independent school, so long as the person, once they are of majority, are able to choose whether or not that faith or that worldview or that mindset is something they wish to take on for themselves. And to me, that's always been a useful guide. I think it's not one that's always been observed by governments, but I think it's a useful principled test. Is can an 18-year-old brought up in this system choose to leave a subculture and join the broader community? And if not, then there does need to be kind of that fundamental liberal commitment to individual right and choice comes into play.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think also one of the ways that I've been thinking through this kind of a question, and it's not fully formed, but is that when we involve civil society in the delivery of education, there's potentially room to also involve civil society in some of the accountability for that education. And so it's sort of asking the question, what is the state authority limited to, and what capacities can also civil society take on? So fidelity to a particular pedagogical approach, for example, Montessori education can be held accountable by Montessori accrediting bodies. Similar values questions about orientation to particular faith traditions should be able to be held accountable by those particular faith leaders or those faith traditions themselves. But then it's really being clear about what is the state rightly accountable for and to. And I think, Jim, the examples that you have just mentioned are clearly ones that are well within its bounds. Student safety, and broadly speaking, academic outcomes, student outcomes, and the ability of a student once they graduate to participate in a liberal democracy. Those things are well within the realm of the state to regulate or to authorize. So that's just one of the ways that I've been thinking about it. We just have maybe time for one last question. I want to end on a hopeful note. I think we're having this conversation at a time when education, certainly some district education, but perhaps education in general, seems to be in some upheaval. What gives you hope for the future of education in Canada?
I mean, I would say two things. One is I think of the innovation we've seen in different ways of delivering programs across all the systems post-COVID, right? We've seen a lot of change in correspondence, distance, flexible type that often comes with a mix of like how you integrate different parts of your life in. I think that is really good. I think although it's causing a massive amount of stress on the system, and again, all of the systems, I think the extent to which we are trying to accommodate different learning needs pedagogically and psychologically is really important. And I do hope that shift has outcomes as we move forward generationally, but it is awfully hard on the system right now. Like, it is putting it and classroom teachers under a tremendous amount of strain, but I see light at the end of that tunnel.
Great. Etienne, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah. Well, to go back to what I was saying about the dialogue between the two two networks in Quebec, I think that there is indeed some hope to be had when you see this dynamic of emulation and interaction going between the two. And personally, I think that the last few years have just shown us that we cannot believe in this uniformity myth anymore, and that as differences and different needs are more diagnosed, that we're more aware that there are indeed some needs that are absolutely different within the network. And I think the educational pluralism way becomes more and more attractive because most people do have this concern about what is common and what can we have in common beyond our different faith, our different culture, and all of this. I think is perfectly legitimate and that we should have this conversation today. However, once we also realize that first, it's not just a religious thing, like different needs are plenty, and we just get out of this ideological position on one side or the other, where it's only maximum freedom or maximum uniformity. And this is where educational pluralism becomes a very interesting model, because it's more about what compromise can we find between what is common and what is different. And so I think that this just purely fact-based realization that we're just recognizing that there are indeed different needs that we now need to accommodate in a different manner certainly gives us maybe a more hopeful future where we can find a model that can suit our need for a common basis with also the different needs that are in society.
That's wonderful. I think that's a really excellent place to end. I want to thank you both very much for joining me, for having this conversation. Not necessarily an easy conversation to have, but I think a fruitful one. And I just also want to thank all of those who attended. Certainly continue to have the conversation, reach out to us. We're always happy to engage. Thank you again for your time.